I just downloaded the first game to support frame generation on consoles. And this is really exciting because until now, this technology has been exclusive to PC. It started with DLSS 3 frame generation, then AMD launched their own version of frame generation, which has now not only been available on more PC hardware, but is now available on console games. Really cool. Now, what does this do in case you're a console gamer? You're like, I haven't even heard about frame generation. What is this? So basically, it gets you a higher frame rate. It shows you more frames, but it does it in a way that has some trade-offs. It does increase the motion fluidity on your screen because you see more frames, so things should look smoother. But the way it does it is by the game renders, two normal frames traditionally, slightly delays showing you one so that it can kind of guess what happened in between, insert that image, and usually does a pretty good job. The higher your base frame rate, the better it usually works. We'll have to see how it plays out on consoles. And so you get more frames. They can have some image quality artifacts, and again, it doesn't increase the responsiveness of the game, which is one of the two main reasons why you want a higher frame rate. But again, the two main reasons you want more frame rate is better responsiveness and better motion fluidity, and this at least gets you one of those two things. But I'm really curious how it runs on console gaming, so let's go ahead and start filming the screen, which is how we'll do this. I'll talk more about how we'll be testing it as we test it. So this is it. We are now playing a game, but the frame generation is not enabled yet. We can kick that on in the menu. We can kick frame generation on, and you can see that the FPS counter on our on-screen display has increased dramatically, and it does look like panning the camera, not canning the camera, is actually looking smoother. Now, we need to do a lot more testing than that, but we should also talk about how am I testing this at all? So how is I getting the performance numbers? Well, one reason we're filming the screen directly, you can see I'm using a camera to just film the screen directly, is so that I have access to my TV's on-screen display. On LG's OLED TVs, but not my Sony OLED TV, so not every TV has this, but you have access to an on-screen display that can show the when you're in variable refresh rate support, and it can also show when you are, what your current frame rate is in the signal that you're getting. And we can see that updating here. So we can see the current frame rate being output to the TV, and this is a 120 hertz TV. So if you were on a locked 60 hertz display, I imagine we'd be getting a different experience. Perhaps we can try to simulate that as well in today's testing. But what we're looking at right now is if you're running on a variable refresh rate capable display, and again, I'm using the filming the screen directly technique in order to be able to see the TV's on-screen display. So again, if we kick frame generation off, we see that we are currently standing still looking at this at 61 frames per second. And if we go ahead and kick variable refresh rate back on, sorry, not variable refresh rate, but frame generation back on, give it a second to kick in, it looks like we are now a little over 100 frames per second. So going from 60 to 90 would be a 50% increase to performance, so we're getting better than that, although it doesn't look entirely consistent. And also keep in mind that the TV's on-screen display for monitoring performance isn't perfect. It's just the best method I have for capturing variable refresh rate performance on a console, since we don't have access to a PC's kind of performance monitoring tech. So I'm just kind of spinning around right now and kind of looking at, okay, so when I hit the thing, what kind of responsiveness do we get? And I've got to say it seems to be pretty responsive. Because one thing about frame generation and its input latency is that it's more noticeable on a mouse and keyboard than it is on a controller, which is one of the reasons why I'm kind of optimistic about this technology on consoles, because your normal input device is a controller, and controllers tend to just, I don't know, because they're less one-to-one motion than a mouse and keyboard is, I feel like the increase to latency is a bit less noticeable. I don't know if I mentioned it or not, but this is Immortals of Aveum. Immortals of Aveum is currently the first game to feature this technology. It's also an Unreal Engine 5 game, so I would think that work done to make things work in this game would be useful for getting it to work in other games running Unreal Engine 5 as well. So again, another reason to be optimistic about this technology in the future. It looks like my on-screen display has disabled itself again. I didn't pay attention to the conversation we're having here. Again, I'm on the free trial mode of this game, which I think anybody can download for free. So if you want to try this out for yourself, if you have a console, it would be cool to see how it runs on a Series S or something like that, which would be a much less powerful hardware, but I don't have a Series S. My only console is a PS5. So that's what we'll be testing it out on today in this video. So again, while we're not like locking to 120 frames per second or anything like that, this is kind of cool. I will say the HUD element doesn't seem to update at the same rate as the rest of the screen. So as I pan back and forth, if you look at, for example, where it says Streetwise Follow Luna, I think the elements underneath that HUD element are updating at a lower frame rate, which is somewhat noticeable, can be a tad bit distracting. So again, not absolutely perfect, but overall performance numbers are looking fairly good here. Let's go ahead and try it out again with the frame generation off, just to kind of compare. So if we go frame generation off, again, the game does appear to be around a 60 FPS experience with some going above and below on that. So anyway, you can tell the game is definitely upscaling pretty aggressively to hit these frame rate targets on console, as there's a lot of kind of FSR shimmering and stuff, but that's not new to the frame generation. That was already kind of how the game rendered on console. Like you can see the hair here is kind of fuzzy. Again, I don't know how well you guys can pick that up because I'm filming the screen at 120 FPS in 1080p because my camera can only go into high refresh mode at 1080p resolution, which is not ideal, but I think that shows the motion fluidity better than I can do with other methods. Also, sorry if you hear a bunch of banging upstairs. My kids are playing upstairs on the weekend while I film a little bit of a video while they are happily doing their own thing. That's just kind of how we roll on the channel. Overall, I've got to say this seems to be working fairly well. You know, really the question is, would I rather play with it on or with it off? Now, when I pan the camera here, you can definitely see chops between frames. You can tell you're not at a super high refresh rate experience, at least if you're used to playing at high refresh rates on you know, PC games and things like that. And so if I go ahead and kick frame generation back on again, it's certainly a much smoother camera pan. And like I said, playing on a controller, I don't really notice a noticeable latency penalty or anything like that. So my main question I have left, I mean, basically what I gotta say is obviously this is a short test, but while you know, obviously it's not as good as running the game natively at a high frame rate, it does look like we are increasing the motion fluidity of the game. I don't feel a massive penalty to latency on a controller, at least in a single player game. And overall, I've got to say that seems like something kind of promising for this technology on consoles. Obviously, we would need a much more extensive test to know everything we would want to know about this. And yeah, my last question is, do we get any benefit on screens that are not variable refresh rate? All right, so in the PS5 menu, I've now turned variable refresh rate support off because I think that unfortunately a lot of console gamers are still on TVs that don't support variable refresh rate. That also means now that my on-screen display here is going to be less helpful because the console is now outputting 120 frames per second, even if the game's not rendering at them. And basically, I just can't trust the 120 frame rate counter. You can tell as I pan the screen here that we're getting a ton of screen tearing, and I can see under the menus, again, that the frame generation looks a little bit weird under those on-screen elements and things like that. So basically, I'm going to turn off the frame rate display because it's not going to be useful here. And now let's look at the settings. So we have VSync on or off. It looks like VSync was off, explaining all the screen tearing that we would get. Frame generation was on. So let's try VSync off, frame gen off. Just kind of film the screen and see what we get here. So if I camera pan here with VSync off and frame gen off, I'm definitely getting a lot of screen tearing and motion judder, which isn't great. So now let me go ahead and try on locking on VSync with frame gen still off. So if I have VSync on, we're now not getting the screen tearing, although there still be a bit of a judder to the camera pan, and it's somewhat smooth. At a higher speed camera pan, I can definitely tell we're not running the game at a super high frame rate or anything like that, but at least we're not getting as much screen tearing here. And then if we go ahead and kick frame generation on, leaving VSync on, let's see how we do. Again, I'm definitely noticing the weirdness under the on-screen display elements. I mean, like the HUD elements, I guess I'm saying, like where it says Streetwise and Target Practice as we pan, things underneath those definitely look a little bit weird. the camera pan, does it feel much smoother? Does it look much smoother than when we had frame generation off? That's really the question, is does this improve the situation? I think it does. I think it does. This feels less smooth. I'm seeing more gaps between frames. Again, while I'm filming the screen at 120 FPS, you guys might not see what I'm seeing in person because YouTube is going to crush this down to 60 FPS. I think frame generation is helping the camera pans, although, like I said, underneath those transparent HUDs does look a little bit weird. And then the only other combination I think we could try, but I don't think it'll be great, is VSync off, frame gen on. If we go ahead and do that, yeah, I think there's just a bit of screen tearing there, so I don't think that would be the preferred way to play. I would say that the improvement was a lot more, with frame generation on, was much more noticeable on a variable, when I was in variable refresh rate mode. This is a lot less less noticeable of an improvement, and you still get the trade-off on things under the on-screen display. So for people running TVs without variable refresh rate support, I think this will be less beneficial perhaps than those where it is. Anyway, let me check if I can get into 60 FPS mode on my TV. Okay, I've set my TV to run in 60 FPS mode, which a lot of people are still playing on 60 frames per second TVs, and I've got something unfortunate to report, which is when we kick on frame generation in 60 FPS mode, it feels really bad from a latency standpoint. So if I kick frame gen off, I don't know how much I can show this to you guys, but you can kind of see maybe the responsiveness between me hitting the joystick and when the controller moves. It feels pretty responsive with frame generation turned off. If I go ahead and kick frame generation on, it feels like a noticeable delay. It would definitely affect my aim in games. Like, again, I don't know if it picks up on the camera, but there is a definite delay in between the joystick movement and when it moves on screen. So here's where the latency issues are definitely going to be noticeable. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people still have a 60 hertz display for their TVs. And I think for them, this is just a bad experience. I wonder if turning off VSync would help on the... Okay, it feels more responsive without VSync, but now we're getting screen tearing, and the whole point of frame generation is to improve motion fluidity. So I guess what I've got to say is, if you're on a 60 hertz display, this actually doesn't seem to be a good thing. It really, really hurts the responsiveness of the game, and that's definitely going to be, I think, something that most people would want to avoid. If you're on a 120 hertz display, it seems to be somewhat of a benefit. You might want to try it out. And if you're on a 120 hertz variable refresh rate display, more like what we have for most people in the PC space, then I think there was actually a noticeable benefit to it. So overall, I've got to say that was a positive experience, but again, if you have the right kind of screen to support it. And unfortunately, I think unlike the PC space, fewer people on consoles have a 120 hertz variable refresh rate display. For those that do, I think frame generation offers something pretty compelling. Now, like I said, on 60 hertz displays, it seems like we're in a pretty rough situation where the input responsiveness was fairly bad, and I don't think I would choose to use the technology. And I think, unfortunately, that puts console game devs into a tricky place on giving people access to this technology. Is it worth implementing on consoles? Because I think for the right users with the right setup, I think it's an improvement to the experience. But for less knowledgeable users who might not know what their display is or whether or not it's beneficial for them based on the type of display that they have, I think with console gaming, a lot of times you take those choices away from users. You get less graphics options in the menus, things like that compared to PC gaming. So I'm curious how this fits into the console, paradigm where you just have a box that works, right? Well, this seems to be giving you a button that works well for some people depending on their setup, but not others. Is there any way maybe they could have the game just detect if you had had your PlayStation running in 120 hertz variable refresh rate mode, in which case allowing frame generation, I think it could be, maybe should be enabled. Maybe if you're on a 60 hertz display, just don't even give users the option. But then maybe some people aren't as latency sensitive as I am and wouldn't have an issue with it. But again, it was pretty noticeable to me. And I'm pretty forgiving of latency on a controller setup. So yeah, I don't know. But I think this is very exciting to see it running on consoles. It does seem to be doing the job. And again, more extensive testing. This was a pretty short little gameplay bit. But like I said, the game's available. Immortals of Aveum as a free trial. I think it gives you access to the first few levels so you could try it out for yourself on your setup. And I'd be really curious how you guys feel it's working for you in the comments section. So be sure to let me know, and let me know what you think about frame generation on consoles. Does it have is it a good fit there? What do you think? Let me know, and I hope everyone has an excellent day.